Hi, folks, and welcome back to Technical Writing. This week, you will be learning about email and professional communication. So, just a few things that you will be learning about this week when you are reading Chapter 2 are reader centered writing, communicating clearly and with precision, and focusing on verbs. So let me just give you a little overview of these things. So what we're talking about when we talk about reader-centered writing is writing that is not so much focused on you, right? And your thought processes and how you would want to take in information, right? Especially not your ideas about how to be the most creative that you can be or the way that you like to talk, right? But more focused on the audience. So it's key in technical writing to understand who your audience is, understand in terms of maybe their demographics, right? Understand their knowledge level of the material and how they need to be addressed in order to understand that material best. So with an expert level audience, right, you can use technical jargon, right? But with a lay audience, you are going to need to explain concepts in terms that they're going to be able to understand without knowing the technical jargon. Okay. In terms of communicating clearly and with precision, right? So this is really important. You need to be concise with the language that you use, but you don't want to use too little language. You also don't want to use too much language. So the way that this works is what you're trying to do is, in as few words as possible, generally, you are trying to convey the message that you need to convey, whether you're giving instructions, right? Whether you're writing a recommendation report or proposal, or maybe you are just conducting some kind of business communication, like an email or a memo, right? You want to use as few words as necessary, generally, to communicate your message, but sometimes there are instances in which you need to use a little bit more language in order to ensure that you are stating what you want to say as clearly as possible. I'm sorry, that's my dog in the background there. Carl, Carl, could you please calm down with your bone over there? Thank you. All right. But the main key here is that you want to be as clear as possible in your language and you want to communicate with precision. You want to make sure that you're saying everything accurately. You want to be very literal and avoid using metaphors. And you want to make sure that your audience is going to understand what it is that you're communicating. Okay. And next, you want to focus on verbs, right? So you want to avoid using too many adjectives. You want to avoid using more nouns than are necessary and focus on those verbs because verbs carry the action in the sentence, right? And when you are using verbs, you want to make sure that you are focusing on active voice, right? Instead of using passive voice, except for situations in which you need to avoid being accusatory. When you want to avoid being accusatory, you can use passive voice. So the next thing that I want to talk about is composing emails. So when you're composing emails, there are a few things we need to talk about. You want to be professional. You want to be formal. You don't want to say more than necessary. You want to ask for what you need. And especially when you are talking to your boss, you don't want to assume that they are going to consider what you're asking for or give you what you're asking for. And then we want to talk about overall netiquette. So netiquette is referring to being professional on the web. Okay, and so this is referring to emails, right? It's referring to messaging, right? It's even referring to like micro messages that you might send out for a business. So when we're talking about netiquette, it's essentially web etiquette, right? So remember that you are always representing your company and you want to be as professional as possible. You always want to be formal and you always want to write imagining that whoever reads your message, right, might be somebody else who is in your company. So imagine that everything you write might be reviewed by the CEO or the president of your company. So everything needs to be something that they would approve of, right? So you want to avoid using curse words, right? You want to avoid really any kind of offensive language. You want to avoid being casual or writing the way that you would just talk, right? You want to avoid using a tone as if you're talking to your friends, right? And you want to make sure that everything that you're writing is direct and to the point. Okay. And you also want to avoid using emojis. Okay, all right. So, in terms of being professional, really it's just covering the things that I just said, but you want to make sure that you are staying within the business context, right? So, there's no reason to be addressing things that are outside of it. Again, you want to be formal, right? So, especially for example, when you're talking to your boss, you don't want to call them by their first name, right? You want to say Mr. or Miss or Mrs., right? According to whichever is the appropriate way to address them. Um, okay, don't say too much. Okay, so you want to keep your messages, right, limited to the necessary language that you need to use to communicate the message that you need to communicate. You don't need to spend a lot of time with the greeting. You don't need to spend a lot of time talking about your day or asking how their day is, because really this is extra time that they're spending reading that, time that could be spent actually working or accomplishing the task that you're asking them to accomplish, right? Because essentially you are coming to them with some kind of a problem that needs to be solved in a lot of cases, right? And so they need to spend that time solving that problem and helping you move forward so that everybody can move forward and accomplish the tasks that are necessary at that job. Okay. Make sure that you clearly ask for what you need in an email. So if you need somebody to share a piece of information with you, you need them to do it by a certain time, such as in the email assignment that we did, then you need to make that clear, right? But you don't want to be demanding. Okay. So you want to make it clear that you need something by a certain time, but don't use language that implies that if they don't give it to you, there's going to be some kind of consequence for them. You don't want to use exclamation points. You don't want it to seem as if you're yelling at them by using all caps, etc. And then when you are doing things like asking for permission from a boss, right? You want to make sure that you don't say things like, thank you for your consideration, or thank you for allowing me to do this, or really thank them for giving you permission for whatever it is, because you don't know yet that you're going to receive that permission. Okay. And finally, what you want to make sure that you do is remember who your audience is and adjust your formality appropriately. Of course, you need to be formal with your coworkers, but that level of formality, right? Sometimes when you're talking to your boss, needs to be the highest level that it can be. All right. So, with all of this in mind, go forth and if you have not done so, complete all of the readings and look at the media for this week, and go ahead as well and complete the assignments. And if you have any questions, reach out to me and I'll be happy to help. Take care.